It's the Master System's very first scandal on Segaiden episode 32. Sega would revisit a handful of games that originally appeared on SG-1000 for release on Master System, primarily drawing from its popular arcade titles. We've already seen Hang On, and now here's Choplifter, the Mega cartridge.
The SG-1000 version of Choplifter shipped in Japan a few months before Sega's arcade adaptation of the game, so that MyCard understandably resembled the original Apple II release. The Master System version, which shipped a year later exclusively in Europe and the US, draws on the coin-op game. This makes it unique among the multiple versions of Choplifter to have appeared on this channel to date, the first home adaptation of the arcade release. That distinction does have meaning. When they converted the computer game into a coin-op release, Sega didn't go to any great lengths to change the core gameplay. Dan Gorlin had designed a perfectly arcade-friendly action game for Broderbund. Rather than rebuild the game from the ground up as they had with Pitfall 2, Sega really just needed to change the goals and objectives, enhance the graphics, and add some new settings. Here as ever, Choplifter puts you in command of a rescue helicopter that needs to make sorties from its home base into enemy territory, where the bad guys have imprisoned dozens upon dozens of civilians. You need to liberate these presumed innocents by blasting open their prisons, touching down near the fleeing captives, and ferrying them safely back to your home base to disgorge them to freedom or to a stern debriefing or whatever. Enemy jets attempt to gun down your chopper while in flight, and ground-based vehicles attempt to destroy you on the ground with no compunctions about taking out civilians in the process. Any civilian you lose due to their being attacked by a tank, trapped in your chopper as it crashes, or simply squished, counts as a loss. The Master System port of the game maintains this gameplay loop and also retains all of the arcade game's new features. It looks miles better than the SG-1000 and Atari 7800 versions of the game, with colorful and detailed sprites and a variety of interesting backgrounds. Unlike the computer game and its console interpretations, Master System's Choplifter changes the metrics for success. Originally, players needed to account for every hostage in a stage in order to complete the level, whether that meant the hostages in question made their way back home safely or died tragically somewhere along the way. Here, however, you only need to rescue 40 hostages before you're allowed to move along. Any hostages who happen to be trapped or running free once you make your rescue run that pushes your tally above 40 are just SOL, which is harsh, but probably the more accurate interpretation of actual US State Department practices. Your chopper also has an incredibly generous storage capacity, as this version allows you to carry more than a dozen civilians at once. This means you potentially need to make fewer rescue runs into the war zone, though it also means you can lose a whole lot more hostages if your chopper goes down. And the bad guys have more ways than ever to take down your helicopter and everyone aboard it in this version. Besides the usual jets and tanks and weather satellites, you also need to deal with jeeps armed with anti-air cannons that can fire higher than the tanks. In later stages, you move to alternate settings, first an ocean, then a cavern, where the enemy's nature changes entirely. On the sea-based stage, for example, the bases and prisons don't appear at all, instead becoming carriers and destroyers, armed with anti-air cannons that you need to take out in order to minimize the crossfire you have to avoid during your outings. A task further complicated by the fact that the superstructure of each ship tends to create barriers that block your turret fire. You'll also find prisons on ships, which means you have to touch down on that vessel's landing pad in order to effect a rescue of the hostages. That gives you less room to maneuver around the scrambling civilians and fewer options for evading marauding gunboats. Some civilians even end up in the water, forcing you to skim the surface between enemy vessels in order to collect them. The promise of more varied settings and mechanics beyond the familiar first stage, a shift teased in the pre-game attract mode, provides extra incentive to come to terms with the difficulty level. Despite the ubiquity of this game across most popular platforms in the 1980s, Choplifter for Master System puts a unique spin on the classic and stands out as an essential conversion. This all adds up to a pretty tough game, but then Choplifter has always been tough and manageable, unlike the next Master System launch title.
Ever wished you could be the champion of an urban space? Well, Sega's about to make your dreams come true with their Sega Card, My Hero.
With My Hero, we begin to see the limitations of the Sega Card format for Master System. On SG-1000, the move to MyCard didn't precipitate an appreciable difference in the depth or quality of software. and Sega only reverted to cartridges for two immense releases, Sherlock Holmes and The Castle. However, the greater graphical fidelity of the Master System necessarily consumes more storage space for graphics, and that results in compromises. It didn't really have much impact on Ghost House, a game that Sega more or less built from the ground up for Sega Card, but for this arcade-to-home conversion, you feel the pinch. In arcades, My Hero, also known in Japan as Seishun Scandal, was an absolute delight, a rollicking, good-natured take on the belt scroller. Debuting in 1985, it clearly riffed on Irem's 1984 hit Kung Fu, though it had a style and personality all its own. For one thing, My Hero incorporated elements of platform gaming, with sequences in which you needed to clear boxes and leap over deadly pits while dodging hazards. While the game lacked Kung Fu's sophisticated martial combat model that allowed for varied attacks at differing heights, it still kept the bits where players had to leap ranged attacks and projectiles by enemies. But My Hero really stood apart thanks to its manga-inspired sensibility. Again, we see that whimsical, cartoonish aesthetic that typified so much Sega work from this era, something that really only came into focus fairly late on SG-1000, which began its run with lots of fairly dry and straightforward-looking games like Starjacker and Yamato. Even once we got to Flicky and Girl's Garden, the SG-1000 simply didn't have the graphical power to display the comical detail seen in Sega arcade creations like Apo or Ninja Princess. The Master System, on the other hand, could pull off a System 1 conversion pretty convincingly, and even do decent justice to a System 16 port like Fantasy Zone. So, fans could be excused if their expectations for arcade adaptations of games like My Hero ran a little higher than, say, Congo Bongo on SG-1000. And, at first glance, My Hero pulls it off reasonably well. You can see that the Master System port suffered from a modest technical downgrade over the arcade title, but compared to something like Wonder Boy on SG-1000, this looks like the real deal. It plays a little more roughly, but you have little doubt that, hey, this is My Hero. Unfortunately, that conviction only lasts until you complete the first stage, because, unlike in the arcade, the first stage is the only stage here. The coin-op My Hero derived a lot of its charm through the way its levels unfolded and the resulting character interactions. In keeping with the style of 80s games, My Hero saw players controlling a teenage boy who had to beat up endless waves of bad guys in order to rescue his abducted sweetheart. You know, like in Kung Fu. My Hero stood apart through its comical pacing. It moved a lot faster than Kung Fu, and it constantly threw new obstacles and dangers at players. The Master System version manages to carry all of that forward, but the teen punks only originally comprised a portion of the adventure. Once you rescued your beloved from the baddie's boss, she would be kidnapped again, immediately, by the next villain. First by an evil ninja who whisked her away to an Edo-era castle, and then by space apes who appeared to steal the poor lady to the planet of the apes. Without these wild swerves in style, My Hero on Master System plays out like a standard street brawler, like an elevated version of Urban Champion or a rough precursor to Renegade. The game becomes more difficult on subsequent loops, introducing new threats and obstacles to the mix, but without the wacky alternate scenarios, it really loses something. A spirit of repentance for once. One of the best parts of the arcade My Hero was the way that the coda to its boss battles leaned into the cliches of shonen anime. Protagonist Steven always faced off against gang bosses against the backdrop of a sunset, trading blows tracked by a damage meter for both characters, the only part of the game in which you didn't have to worry about one-hit kills. Successfully besting the boss would result in a little cutscene in which Steven would give a heartfelt speech in pantomime to his weeping rival as they gazed out at the sunset in classic manga style. Alas, the boss from the next stage would take this opportunity to leap from a temporal portal and abscond with Steven's girlfriend Remy, segueing into the next stage. Since My Hero for Master System only has the one stage, these interstitial scenes consist of Steven giving the game boss an earnest speech only for the villain to snatch Remy away himself and begin the cycle anew. Functionally, it amounts to the same thing, a lead into more action, but optically it kind of misses the spirit of the whole thing and makes Steven look like a gullible dope. Oh well, it's not like most people would ever be able to see that little segue in any case. Sega compensated for the lack of content in this My Hero port by making it unreasonably difficult, way harder than the arcade game. Steven has the same terrible fisticuffs range as Mick from Ghost House, but unlike Mick, Steven doesn't take it on the chin too well. He goes down with a single hit from anyone except the gang boss. Sure, fine, the arcade game worked the same and it was perfectly fine. What makes the home port so much less enjoyable? The difference all comes down to timing. The coin-op version of My Hero gave you a fairly generous window in which to strike attackers before they could clobber Steven. But the Master System version reduces that window down to a matter of a few frames, a mere split second. If you don't hit enemies at the precise moment they come into Steven's range, they will instantly knock you unconscious. Enemies surround you and attack in staggered waves that force you to pivot constantly to fend off foes in both directions. That's all well and good in keeping with the coin-op game and its inspiration Kung Fu, and its homegrown antecedent Dragon Wong. But unfortunately, Steven suffers from a bit of control lag when he turns. Changing directions causes him to momentarily freeze up and lose his ability to punch, leaving you extremely vulnerable when you turn around. You can compensate for this weakness to a certain degree by crouching and kicking, which gives you slightly better attack range, or by using jump kicks, which have great range and a decent active time that allows you to clear multiple enemies in a single shot. But no matter what, all it takes is the slightest hiccup in your attack timing to die to an instant sucker punch by street gangs. I have to assume that Sega's programmers implemented the incredibly strict timing requirement here, along with the removal of the arcade's continue feature, as a way to make up for the home conversion's relative lack of substance. I can understand the impulse to prevent players from completing their new purchase in a matter of minutes. The rebalanced difficulty has the side effect of creating an almost comically difficult game. One that feels like you spend more time watching the mandatory intro cutscene than actually playing. The home conversion also loses one of the coin-op game's most entertaining features, the ability to free a captive bystander from the bad guys, which will cause him to team up with you and double your attack power. It does retain the ability to punch bottles out of the air, some of the platforming sequences later in the level, but on the whole, the home conversion of My Hero amounts to a massive downgrade from the original game. Where Hang On, Fantasy Zone, and Choplifter turned out great on Master System despite their technical inferiority to the source material, those ports succeeded because they retained as much content as possible and clearly did their best to preserve the feel of the coin-op games. My Hero, on the other hand, looks nearly as good as the coin-op game, but loses 2/3 of its content while tweaking the gameplay for the worse. So, what should have been a spot-on arcade port ends up being a frustrating wreck. Real shame.
And finally, Sega's pioneering effort to make video games based around cute young pop idol singers makes its American debut under the title Teddy Boy. Cute idol pop singer Yoko Ishino, however, does not.
As you'll recall from the Mark III launch, Teddy Boy did a respectable job of adapting an arcade game to console. Unlike My Hero, it didn't really lose anything of value in making the transition to Sega Card, and it even looked nearly as good as the coin-op title. The American localization loses the word blues from the title, but otherwise looks, plays, and sounds exactly like the Japanese release. That is, with one exception. The song that gave the game its title failed to make its way into the overseas release. In Japan, Sega sold Teddy Boy Blues as a sort of tie-in with a retro 50s love song by the same name, which had seen some modest pop chart success for its performer, teen idol Yoko Ishino. The musical idol craze had just begun to take hold of Japanese pop culture in the mid-1980s, and Sega was one of the first game publishers to capitalize on the trend. Sega had licensed music before for its games, including Popcorn for Pengo, but Teddy Boy Blues took that strategy to the next level as a game whose entire sales appeal hinged on its connection to a chiptune rendition of a radio ditty. For whatever reason, it seems Sega couldn't, or simply didn't want to, license the song Teddy Boy Blues for the US release, replacing the in-game melody with a new tune and erasing any mention of Ishino from the American marketing material. This makes no difference whatsoever to the Master System game. The new melody is perfectly catchy on its own, and it has no impact on the gameplay. And of course, the gameplay itself has no meaningful connection to Ishino's song in any case. You play as a kid with a beret and a submachine gun who has to destroy a variety of monsters inside infinitely scrolling mazes. The monsters emerge from dice-shaped boxes, whose numbers decrement every time a bad guy pops out, and once you've cleared away all the creatures in the maze, you move along to the next stage. Gunning down an enemy doesn't kill them, but rather reduces them to a sort of larval form or something. And you need to collect those larval balls before they grow impatient, turn into tiny soot-like monsters, and devour a portion of the stage timer. It's an odd game, and it really has nothing to do with love songs about elaborately coiffed teenage punks in Beatles-era England. But it plays well, and the mechanics work as a cohesive whole. So, on the balance, it's a worthy addition to the Master System library. and a much-needed counterbalance to the mess that is my hero.
Next time on Segaiden, it looks like combat is in the cards.